Every generation or so, frustration in Northern Ontario with their southern neighbours in general and the Ontario government in particular reaches a tipping point. Last night we heard from the leader of the new Northern Ontario Party on why the North needs to go it alone. Tonight, let's find out how that message is resonating this time. Joining us now from Thunder Bay, Ontario, Laura Paquette. She's Professor of Political Science at Lakehead University. In Sudbury, Ontario, via Skype, Eric White, reporter for CBC Sudbury. And here in studio, Stan Sudol, who is the editor of Republic of Mining, which is a mining aggregator website. It's good to have all of you on our program again tonight. I want to start, Laura, with you in northwestern Ontario. It is, as we suggested in the intro, this is something that sort of happens every generation, where discontent bubbles to the surface and we get, musings of a separatist movement. Is it worse now than in previous incarnations?
That's hard to say because we don't work with any sort of public opinion polling on such issues. But certainly I think it's revealing that we've got a party that's rebranded itself as the Northern Ontario Party. And they've abandoned the idea of going and joining Manitoba. Now they want a separate province altogether.
And what are you hearing, Eric, in terms of, from your vantage point, in your part of the province on this issue?
I think there's been some news coverage about this latest petition and this latest party. It's sort of just a slightly different name. It used to be called the Northern Ontario Heritage Party. Now it's the Northern Ontario Party. But I couldn't tell you that I hear people in coffee shops talking about dreams for the new province we're about to create. I'd say that among the general public, very few people are talking about this.
Stan, is the notion of a new province of Northern Ontario viable?
Probably not, but the fact that we've got 4 members in cabinet who are from Northern Ontario and you're still having a new political party for Northern separation forming has to be a real blow to the present premier. It looks like the frustration with a lot of issues, environmental issues, mining issues are bubbling over, and the feeling that the 2 opposition parties may not have credible policy responses is causing this third party to form.
Let me follow up with Laura on that, because you make a good point that there are 4 Liberal MPPs in Northern Ontario, and all 4, Laura, are in cabinet. So how is it that the North still feels it's not being listened to when it does have that much presence at the cabinet table?
Well, the sorts of issues that Mr. Holiday mentioned to you are things that I've been hearing since I've been living in Thunder Bay. And I also have to point out that, first of all, cabinet ministers must support cabinet decisions. And I've always thought that Wynn's large cabinet had that in mind. And also, just look at the numbers of the dollars coming here versus the investments being made in the Golden Horseshoe. Obviously, there's differences in population and therefore voters. But that's the sort of thing that Northerners notice.
The Mr. Holiday you referred to is Trevor Holiday, who is a bus driver who has now resurrected this Northern Ontario Party, or I guess resurrected the Northern Ontario Heritage Party in its new incarnation. He was on the program last night. Let's play a snippet of that interview. Sheldon, if you would.
There's a lot of misconception on what's coming from the North, what's given to the South. Resources. The Ministry of Northern Development and Mines in 2013 had a surplus. Well, that's money just out of the North. Where did that money go? When asked of the government where this money goes, what money comes from the North, what comes from the South, there's no direct, clear-cut numbers. The tax dollars, what comes out of the North?
Eric, can you help us on this? There's always this controversy about whether or not the tax revenues that come out of mining and forestry and so on are staying in the North or going to pay for things in the South. What can you tell us on that?
Unfortunately, I can't tell you very much. I know that here in the CBC Sudbury newsroom, we've tried to calculate these numbers before and tried to get some sense of this, because this is certainly what people always say. We pay more than our fair share. Exactly calculating that becomes so complicated, but determining exactly what money is spent where, from which department, which ministry, gets very complicated to find out. I think this idea comes from the real original idea of a Northern Ontario province from the late 1800s, early 1900s, when it was certainly true and there was massive mineral resources being extracted here and forest resources that really paid for a lot of Toronto being built. and being built up at that time. So there was certainly a time it was true. If I had to guess, I'd probably say it hasn't been true for a while, but actually pinning down those numbers and reporting them journalistically has become a big challenge. And I'd love to tell that story, but we can't.
Stan, can you weigh in with any help on that?
Well, just to add to the issue of the amount of resource wealth, when you take a look at the big bank towers in downtown Toronto, we're forgetting that a lot of people down there still work in the mining industry and the financing. Toronto became the mining financing capital of the world because of Cobalt, Timmins, Kirkland Lake, northwestern Quebec.
Sudbury.
And Sudbury. So you're looking at all these mining investments, 150 years of that has funneled and has helped Southern Ontario, and particularly Toronto, excel financially.
Laura, because you're in Northwestern Ontario, I want to circle back to something you referred to in your first answer, and that is this notion of, because so much of Northwestern Ontario actually is in the same time zone as Manitoba, and is so far from Queen's Park, which is the capital city, obviously, of the province of Ontario, there is appeal for some to be part of Manitoba. Can you explain more about why that appeal is there?
Well, I think it's primarily we all love to hate Toronto and decisions and policies made at Queen's Park sort of feeling. And when they look across to Manitoba, they see a province that has is used to population density differences. So basically everybody's in Winnipeg, and beyond that, the population density falls, and that's one of the characteristics of Northwestern Ontario. I'm speaking from Thunder Bay. I'm sure the rest of the region would say we all love to hate Thunder Bay.
But for example, let me follow up on that. If you lived in Fort Frances or you lived in Kenora, would you feel culturally and economically a better fit with Winnipeg, Manitoba than you would with Toronto, Ontario?
Well, that was the appeal of the previous incarnation of this party to the Northern Ontario Heritage Party, and that was the plan. The problem with the plan was that both premiers would have to agree, and I had trouble imagining that Kathleen Wynne or any of her predecessors would have agreed to that. But there was a very strong feeling, and it's beyond just the time zone. I think they felt that there would be a better understanding of small town life and small town economies.
Eric, how about you on that? How much do you pick up of this notion that we'd be better off on our own, or maybe even joining Manitoba?
I mean, I think that sentiment has always been around, and I don't think it'll ever really totally go away, that people from Northern Ontario identify. It's very unlikely to hear somebody call themselves an Ontarian. They're more likely to call themselves a Northerner. Right? So I think there's this emotional part of this. And I'm reminded of the recent referendum in Scotland where they were talking about separating from Great Britain, and you heard people say, if I'm voting with my heart, I think of myself as a Scot, but if I'm voting with my head, in an administrative government sense, it makes sense to stay with our neighbors to the south. And I think that's the same for people in Northern Ontario. But the feeling, I don't think, will ever go away, no matter what the government in Queen's Park does to try to kowtow to that sentiment. I think that feeling will always be here.
Stan, it does kind of raise some questions about how much Ontario nationalism there really is. I mean, you talk to Quebecers and you talk to Albertans. You know, many of them are Quebecers first, Albertans first. You never hear that in the province of Ontario. Maybe sometimes in the north, though. They're Northerners first before they're Ontarians.
Absolutely, because Ontario tends to think of themselves as Canada, okay? And for much, except for the McGuinty Wynne era, for much of our history, we've been paying, sending equalization payments to other parts of the country, and so we just feel that that's part of our obligation. And of course, with the McGuinty Wynne era, we are now becoming a have-not province. Whereas in Northern Ontario, we've always felt we've always had our own resource culture. We tend to look at land differently than people in Southern Ontario. It's a broad brushstroke, but I take a look at Southern Ontario as more of an environmental culture, where they look at Northern Ontario as one big park for our benefit, a very colonial attitude. Whereas in Northern Ontario, we tend to look at the land is, okay, we have forestry and pulp and paper, it's a renewable resource, we plant trees, we have enormous geological resources, we dig mines, and we go up the value chain. Sudbury being a case where the expertise in mining is recognized globally.
Yeah, but the funny thing about this, Laura, let me bring you in on this. The funny thing about this is this issue seems to come up regardless of who's in power. I mean, Stan said it's been a factor during the McGuinty and Wynne era, fair enough. But, Mike Harris was from North Bay. He was premier from 1995 to 2002, and we heard rumblings of this then too. Is there no mainline political party in the province today that can adequately represent the feelings of Northerners in your view?
Well, it's a tall order. You have to understand the region very thoroughly. You have to understand the attitudes very thoroughly. And what you're looking at is a huge landmass, very few voters, and an economy that runs counter-cyclical to what's happening in Southern Ontario for at least as long as I've been here. So that the policies that are made to cover the province don't really fit, and it doesn't matter who's in power. Mr. Daybell, who was the predecessor to Mr. Holloway with the previous party, I mean, he set up a tent at Queen's Park in the 70s, I think, to protest these very issues we've been discussing.
Quite right. Protested the Bill Davis government, and that didn't go anywhere either. I mean, Eric, in your reporting, do you get any sense that if another party were in power, these issues might be less dramatic than they are now?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the catalyst is for this time coming up. I know Mr. Halliday works for the Ontario Northland Transportation Commission, so that could be part of it, although the plans to divest that have sort of gone away. The train service hasn't returned. I mean, you mentioned Mike Harris being the premier. There was also a brief moment there where the leader of every party was from Northern Ontario, with Lynn MacLeod and Howard Hampton. And so, like I said before, I don't think this sentiment is necessarily based on that. I think it's always going to be easy for Northerners to say they don't understand us, and that's why that's why this isn't working out, or that's why we don't get this thing that we would like here.
In which case, Dan, if separatism is unlikely to be in the cards, and if joining Manitoba is unlikely to be in the cards, what could be done to make people in Northern Ontario feel that their concerns were being more listened to by the people who make the decisions at Queen's Park?
First, for starters, a little bit more autonomy on land use up in Northern Ontario.
How do you do that? Municipality by municipality?
I don't have the magic formula for it, but I mean, what's happening right now is, let's take a look at the Ring of Fire. There's enormous frustration in Northern Ontario that it's taken so long. We haven't even, the discovery was made in 2007. We're supposed to get some feedback this fall, and we're hoping that the provincial government will set aside funds for an east-west road, which is 280 kilometers that will connect the 4 First Nations.
They've had $1 billion set aside in every budget for that road.
Absolutely.
So why isn't it happening?
Exactly. It makes me think, is it in the scope of, well, if we build this road, the environmentalists in Southern Ontario will be upset, because there's the sense of the environmental vote will always be larger than the First Nations or Northern Ontario vote. And any party has to understand that. So is that what's slowing this down?
Laura, follow up on that if you would. How could Queen's Park give more power to Northern Ontario to be in charge of its own affairs?
The evil D word, devolution. So in other words, provide regions with more decision-making power. Now, not everybody in Thunder Bay or Northwestern Ontario agrees that the health integration networks have worked well, but that would certainly be a starting point to think about ways of providing the opportunity for people up here to make decisions that fit this part of the world.
But if I can use an analogy, Eric, you know, if the Premier wants to allow the City of Toronto, for example, to have more power over its own affairs, she can do that. She passed, and remember that happened, they passed the City of Toronto Act, and Toronto got more powers. Because there's a government in Toronto, the city. There's no government of Northern Ontario. So how do you devolve power to the north in a same kind of a way to give Northerners a greater say over their destiny?
I don't know if there is an easy way to do it. I know that recently New Democrat from Timiskaming-Cochrane, John Vantoff, suggested they have a Northern Ontario caucus where policy decisions, and I think at the time he was thinking specifically of the spring bear hunt, which has kind of been a flashpoint for this separatist sentiment, that this caucus would then decide the issues in the north. But I mean, you can't just have, I mean, for one, it's mostly opposition MPs, but you can't have 11 MPPs sort of overruling the moves of the government. I mean, how that would work in determining budgets and all that would be massively complicated. But
having said that, I mean, I'm just imagining, and maybe you could help fill it in for the people who are watching this program south of the French River. When the government of Ontario gives billions of dollars to car companies to bail them out of difficulty, but doesn't do so for timber companies or forestry companies or, you know, the smelting companies, for example, and those industries disappear, you know, explain why everybody up north is so upset about that. I mean, it sort of writes itself.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great example. I mean, the auto bailouts compared to the forest industry that's really sort of gone through a major slump and kind of coming out of it a bit now. But people feel generally forgotten that that you hear about things being spent on money being spent in Southern Ontario, and that things don't change in Northern Ontario as much as they could, and they just feel that every announcement that the government is making is about big money being spent down there. Where here, you have towns, especially in the forest sector, the towns that are sort of disappearing, and people wondering about how long they're going to stay here. Their kids are looking to move to the south. There's no employment here. And so I think that really drives that feeling. And yeah, if there was a Northern Ontario government, I'm sure they would pay more attention to the forest industry because it would be more a bread and butter industry.
Or Laura Paquette, let's take an even more recent example. I mean, what they used to call Algoma Steel is in difficulty again. Is there an expectation by people in Sault Ste. Marie that the government of Ontario, I don't know what, buys it or helps out or bails it out or something in order to keep SR in the Soo operating?
All I can tell you is there was a lot of resentment when they bailed out the auto industry, and then the forest industry in the north got loan guarantees. Yes, there are very serious expectations, and I have to say, I think people are expecting to be disappointed yet again, despite our fabled 4 ministers in cabinet.
In which case, in our last few minutes here, there's every possibility that somebody from the government of Ontario is watching this program right now, in which case, I think you should pass some advice up the food chain. Stan, you want to start us off? What could Premier Wynne and her cabinet and government do in order to give the sense that the North was being listened to more?
2 quick hits. One is hydro rates. An industrial hydro rate. I know they have some kind of a payback right now for large electricity producers.
They say that. They say they've got mitigation programs in place for big electricity users in the province.
But is it enough? All right. And should you make all of Northern Ontario a lower cost power section just because resource industries are so heavily dependent on power? And for mining, it's 1/3 of mining costs. If you want a value-added industry with smelters and refineries, again, significant power users. So have something embedded where it is long-term, not government to government. And then the other issue is the Ring of Fire. And I hate beating a dead horse here. Or I'm hoping it's not a dead horse, but
get it going.
Yes, because we're talking $60 billion potential that not only benefits Northwestern Ontario First Nations communities, but the economic impact will be felt in Southern Ontario.
Eric, in our last minute here, you want to give some advice?
That's something that journalists don't typically do. But like I said before, I think that sentiment is going to be there no matter what they do. I mean, certainly I'm sure the Liberals are going to say in the next election that they listen to the North a lot. They brought back the spring bear hunt. They've four-lining 69. I think they're going to say that they've spent a lot of money here, and I think that's going to be up for the voters to decide whether they're doing enough or not.
And Lord Patrick Brown has said he's been to the North 20 times, and he has high expectations of winning more than just the 2 out of the 11 seats he now has. What do you think his chances are?
A lot depends on the caliber of candidate that he can actually produce. That's been the problem in the past, and I think that there are several seats, Liberal seats, that are quite vulnerable in the coming election.
Oh, you want to name names?
He's going to hate me again, but Minister Morrow, Thunder Bay Atikokan, if they can get a really good candidate up against him, I think he's going to be in serious trouble, even though his majority increased last round.
I was going to say, I think one time he won that seat by 60 votes, and then the next time out it was something like 5,000. So he's, he's doing okay.
Down, yes. Yeah, well, I agree with Hugh that his majority has increased, but I still think that he's vulnerable.
Understood. Thanks to the 3 of you for helping us out with this conversation tonight here on TVO. Laura Paquette and Eric White in, what shall we call it, north of the French River in Thunder Bay and Sudbury specifically, and Stan Sudol from here in good old Toronto.
Thank you.
That everybody loves to hate.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.